Welcome, dear listeners, to Whispers in the Dark, where shadows tell stories and the night breathes secrets. I'm your guide through the unknown, your storyteller in the silence, weaving tales that will haunt your thoughts long after the last word fades. Here, we embrace the eerie, the unsettling, the stories that lurk just beyond the edge of the firelight. So settle in, dim the lights, and listen closely. The darkness has something to say. So let's begin this grotesque tale, the Sirens Call. The mist clung to the hills like a silent, ghostly shroud as Marcus drove down the narrow, winding road, the headlights barely making a dent in the suffocating darkness. The engine hummed steadily, but his mind was far from settled. The road had become increasingly treacherous the deeper he ventured into the countryside, and his thoughts began to spiral toward the reason he had come to this forsaken place in the first place. He'd heard the stories, of course. Everyone who lived near Llyn Ddraig had. They were stories passed down through generations, whispered in local pubs, shared in dark corners of cottages, and told over the warmth of hearth fires. They spoke of a lake haunted by an ancient, malevolent spirit, its water still, as though untouched by time, and its depths unknowable. And at the heart of it all, the legend of the mermaid. Her beauty was said to be otherworldly. Her voice, ethereal, could soothe the most tormented soul or drive a man mad with longing. She would lure men into the lake with her song, drawing them to their doom. No one knew for sure where she had come from or how long she had been trapped in the water, but the villagers had no doubts. The mermaid was the reason that Llyn Ddraig had claimed so many lives over the centuries. It was the disappearance of young Thomas Llewellyn in 1823 that solidified the legend's place in local lore. Thomas had gone missing while out playing by the lake, and despite frantic searches, no trace of him was ever found. It was said that his body had been pulled under by the mermaid, his soul claimed by the cold depths of the water. His family never recovered from the loss, and their grief was compounded by the strange whisperings that emerged in the wake of his disappearance. Fishermen reported hearing a haunting melody emanating from the lake at night, and a few claimed they had seen a pale, ghostly figure hovering at the water's edge, a figure with eyes too dark to be human. Marcus had dismissed these stories as superstitions, nothing more than rural legends designed to frighten tourists. But now, as he neared Llyn Ddraig, something in the air seemed different. The silence, the thickness of the fog, the eerie stillness of the surroundings, all of it felt unsettling. The lake loomed ahead, its waters hidden behind a veil of mist, as though guarding some terrible secret. When Marcus finally arrived, the darkness was complete. The only sound was the hum of his car's engine as he parked on the edge of the lake. He grabbed his camping gear and stepped out, the cool air biting at his skin. The firewood crackled as he set up camp, the faint scent of damp earth mixing with the musky fragrance of pine trees. But even as he set up, his eyes kept drifting back to the lake, which seemed to hold an unnatural stillness in its surface. The fire flickered weakly against the oppressive darkness surrounding him, casting long, menacing shadows. Marcus felt a shiver crawl up his spine as he stared out at the mist-covered water. He could feel something watching him, though he couldn't pinpoint why. The lake stretched out before him, as dark and impenetrable as the night itself. The silence was oppressive, almost suffocating, and yet despite the chill that clawed at his bones, he found himself drawn toward the water's edge. For a moment, he stood there, staring into the blackness. It was too still, too unnerving. Then, just as he turned to retreat back to the warmth of the fire, he thought he saw something. A figure, barely visible through the mist, standing at the edge of the lake. At first, he thought it was nothing more than a trick of the light or the shifting shadows. But then the figure seemed to move, its outline becoming clearer. A woman. Her shape was pale against the fog, long flowing hair cascading down her back like a veil of silver. But what caught his attention was her eyes. They were impossibly dark, like endless pits, hollow and empty, staring back at him with an eerie intensity. Her figure was unmistakably human, but there was something off about it. She stood unnaturally still, her gaze fixed directly on him. Marcus froze, his breath caught in his throat. The figure was so close, yet too far to touch, and he couldn't make sense of what he was seeing. His mind screamed for him to turn away, to retreat, but his legs felt like they were locked in place, and his feet refused to obey. His pulse quickened, a mix of confusion and fear flooding his chest. And then, she moved. The woman's body twitched and shifted like a shadow sliding across water, but her gaze never left him. Her mouth, though barely visible in the fog, parted slightly, as if to speak, but no words came. The silence between them seemed to stretch on forever, but Marcus could hear something beneath the stillness, a faint melody that seemed to vibrate in his bones. It was soft at first, barely audible over the wind, but as it grew louder, it twisted into a high, melodic hum, an unnatural hum that seemed to reverberate within his skull. It was a song, no, a call, a beckoning, and then her lips parted wider, the sound of the melody becoming clearer, more intense. The low, haunting song seemed to emanate from her, as though her very being was a vessel for the impossible beauty of the sound. Marcus's heart began to race. His mind screamed at him to run, to escape, but his body betrayed him, rooted to the spot, as if the song itself was ensnaring his senses, pulling him toward the water. It was impossible. He knew it was impossible. He knew this was the mermaid, just a story, just a myth, but his instincts couldn't deny the sensation that washed over him. The song wrapped itself around him like a rope, tightening with every note. The figure in the mist continued to watch him, her eyes burning into his very soul, her features almost ghostly in their beauty. The more he stared, the less real she seemed, until he couldn't tell where the mist ended and the figure began. She was both fair and not fair, a figment, and yet so much more. Marcus shook his head, snapping himself out of the trance-like state. With a sharp breath, he forced his legs to move, stumbling back toward the fire, his mind racing. He couldn't explain it, but whatever he had seen, whatever that thing was, it wasn't human. He turned back toward the water, but when he glanced at the lake, the figure was gone. The fog hung heavy, thick with an unnatural silence, but Marcus couldn't shake the feeling. She was still out there, watching, waiting, and as the mist thickened and the cold crept deeper into his bones, Marcus couldn't help but feel that the nightmare was only just beginning. The fire flickered weakly, its flames casting long, erratic shadows that danced across the surrounding trees. Marcus had returned to his camp with the image of the woman's ghostly figure burned into his mind. Her dark, hollow eyes, and her eerie, melodic song haunted him. His heart still raced, and the chill in the air seemed to pierce deeper into his bones than before. But he tried to push the thoughts away, convincing himself that it had all been a figment of his imagination.
It's just the fog messing with my mind,
He muttered to himself, stoking the fire with a handful of dry twigs. But even as the flames crackled and popped, the gnawing feeling in the pit of his stomach wouldn't subside. The haunting melody lingered in his ears, the soft hum like a whisper he couldn't escape. It was almost as if it was still coming from the lake, beckoning him to return. His rational mind screamed at him to stay away from the water, but something deep inside pulled him toward it. He tried to shake off the feeling, retreating to his tent and lying down, staring at the ceiling in the dark. But sleep wouldn't come. Every rustle of the wind outside made his heart skip. Every creak of the trees felt like a step closer to the edge of the lake. The world outside seemed to grow heavier, as though something was moving just beyond the reach of his senses. It wasn't until the clock struck midnight that Marcus heard it again, the faint melody that had tormented him earlier, now louder, clearer, and much more distinct. The sound floated through the air like a breeze, the lilting notes slipping past the thin walls of his tent, filling the space with a haunting beauty. It wasn't the same as before. The song wasn't just a hum now. It was a voice, soft, almost pleading, and yet unbearably seductive. He sat up, his heart pounding against his ribs. The song, it was different now, sharper, more insistent. It seemed to speak directly to him, each note wrapping itself around him, making him feel like he was being drawn into something beyond his control. Marcus tried to block it out, but the sound seemed to seep into his very soul, filling him with a gnawing hunger. Slowly, he unzipped the tent and crawled out into the night, the fog so thick now that it seemed to swallow everything. The trees loomed like black, gnarled giants, and the air was heavy with the scent of damp moss and earth. His legs moved of their own accord, drawn toward the lake. The sound grew louder, closer. The fog parted as he reached the shore, revealing the still, black surface of the water. The lake's surface shimmered faintly in the pale light of the moon, but the mist surrounding it was so dense that he could barely see a few feet in front of him. The silence was unnerving. Only the sound of his own breath broke through the thick quiet. And then he saw it. The figure stood at the water's edge, its outline barely visible through the veil of mist. The woman. She was the same as before, but now her form seemed clearer, more defined. Her long hair cascaded down her back like a veil of silver, and her eyes, those dark, soulless eyes, fixed on him with an intensity that sent a shiver racing up his spine. But it was the sound of her voice that truly made his blood run cold. It was no longer a faint whisper, but a clear, almost tangible melody that wrapped around him like cold steel. She whispered to him, "Come closer, Marcus." Her voice as soft as velvet, as smooth as silk, but dark and laden with something sinister. Her words were sweet, inviting, and yet there was something in them, something lurking beneath the surface that felt wrong. He felt it in his chest, a deep, aching pull. It was like a drug, each note seeping into him, urging him closer. "Come Feel the water. Feel me, she coaxed. For a moment, Marcus froze. He should turn around, run, scream, anything to snap him out of the trance she was weaving. But he couldn't. His body moved forward on its own, his feet slipping across the wet ground toward the water's edge. His thoughts blurred and his vision dimmed, the song wrapping around him like a noose, tightening with every step. As he approached the lake, the air grew colder, the fog thickening, choking off any escape. The woman's figure began to change. Her long, pale arms reached out, her fingers stretching toward him like claws. The sweet voice became warped, distorted, twisting into something otherworldly.
You will drain me,
she whispered, and the whisper turned to a shriek, filled with unholy hunger. The song was gone now, replaced with a growl, a guttural, bone-chilling sound. The woman's face began to contort, her skin stretching tight across her skull, her mouth opening impossibly wide to reveal rows of jagged, sharp teeth. Her eyes, those deep, dark eyes, glowed red now, like burning coals, as they locked onto his with an intensity that pierced him to the core. She was no longer the beautiful woman he had seen before. Her skin was rotting, her hair falling out in clumps, her mouth filled with jagged, dripping teeth. She was a thing of nightmares, a monster of the deep. Marcus stumbled backward, his heart pounding, the fog swirling around him like a living entity. The woman, the mermaid, was no longer calling to him. She was laughing, a low, guttural sound that rattled his very bones, as if she was savoring his terror. Before he could turn to run, something pulled him forward. Strong, powerful hands gripped his body, yanking him toward the water's edge. He tried to scream, but his voice was lost in the oppressive mist, drowned out by the sound of the woman's laughter. He reached for anything, his fingers grazing the cold, slick rocks. But it was too late. Her claws sank into his skin, dragging him closer to the water, and the darkness beneath the surface beckoned. As the water reached his waist, a woman's voice changed again, soft and pleading.
Come into the depths with me, Marcus. It is your fate.
And then, with one final, terrifying lurch, she pulled him under. The cold engulfed him, the darkness consuming his every sense. His body was crushed by the weight of the water, and his vision blurred. He gasped, but the water rushed into his lungs, drowning him. In the suffocating blackness, he heard her voice again, this time as a soft whisper in his ear.
You were always mine,
she said sinisterly.
Now, you belong to me, Marcus, forever.
And with that, Marcus was pulled deeper into the darkness, lost to the lake forever. The moon hung low in the sky, an eerie crescent barely breaking through the thick fog that clung to the surface of the lake. The air was suffocating, cold and heavy, with the damp smell of earth and decay. The water lapped against the shore, a rhythmic, mournful sound that seemed to echo through the dense trees surrounding the lake. Marcus's body lay motionless on the shore, his eyes wide open but unseeing. His breath came in shallow gasps, every inhalation a struggle, as if the air had turned too thick to breathe. He was alive, but barely. And the nightmare was far from over. As Marcus slowly regained his senses, the world around him felt wrong, hollow, twisted, and suffocating. The once peaceful lake now seemed like a vast, endless void, the darkness stretching out before him, inviting him to plunge deeper into its depths. His heart hammered in his chest, and his limbs trembled as though they had a life of their own. He wanted to scream, but his voice was lost, choked in his throat by the suffocating presence of the lake. He pushed himself up onto his hands and knees, his mind racing. The memory of the mermaid, no, the creature, the way it had looked, the way its claws had sunk into his flesh, flashed through his thoughts. He tried to push it away, tried to force his brain to focus, but it was impossible. The vision of her rotting form, her eyes glowing with a malevolent hunger, was burned into his mind, and every part of him screamed to escape. But his body was weak, drained by whatever the creature had done to him. For a moment, he thought he was going mad. His vision flickered, the landscape shifting in and out of focus. His eyes darted back to the water, where the ripples were still, but something was wrong. Something moved beneath the surface, something that wasn't human, something large and dark. The thought of the mermaid, or whatever she was, made his stomach turn, and he couldn't shake the feeling that it was waiting for him to move, to step closer to the water once again. The air was so thick now, it felt like he was swimming through it, each breath a struggle, his chest tight with panic. He could taste the bitter, metallic tang of fear in the back of his throat, and every sound, the rustle of the trees, the lapping of the water, the snap of twigs underfoot, felt as though it was magnified, vibrating in his skull. Suddenly, the ground beneath him seemed to shift. The very earth trembled. His head snapped toward the edge of the lake as the surface of the water began to ripple, sending shivers of dread through his spine. There was movement beneath the still water, something large and disturbing, something alive. It was there again, the dark shape, now unmistakably closer to the surface. His breath caught in his throat, and his pulse quickened. He wasn't alone. Before he could react, a figure emerged from the water. It was her, the mermaid, but this time, she wasn't emerging slowly, her pale form gradually appearing as though rising from some ancient grave. No, this time, she rose fast, the water cascading down her long, tangled hair, her face twisted in a hideous grin. Her skin, pale and slick, stretched tight across her skeletal frame, and the empty sockets of her eyes burned with an unnatural crimson glow. She was more monstrous now, her once alluring appearance fully corrupted by something dark, something ancient and evil that bled into the very air around her. Marcus recoiled in horror, but his body refused to cooperate. His muscles screamed at him to move, but he was frozen in place, his body unwilling to obey his mind's frantic commands. She tilted her head to one side, her eyes never leaving him, as though toying with him. She took a step toward him, her long webbed fingers stretching out toward him, and the air grew colder, far colder than it should have been. Her breath, if it could be called that, was like a deathly gust, sharp and biting, a wind that froze his very marrow. Marcus struggled to stand, his legs shaky, but before he could even make it halfway to his feet, a cold grip seized him by the wrist. Her fingers, long, thin, and impossibly strong, wrapped around his arm like iron chains. She was pulling him closer, dragging him toward the lake once more, and this time he couldn't fight it. His mind screamed for him to break free, but the grip was too tight, She was impossibly strong. The cold seeping into him from her touch seemed to freeze him from the inside out, filling him with an overwhelming sense of dread. Her voice, soft, haunting, whispered in his ear, her words like honey, but they dripped with malice.
Oh, you should have listened. You should have stayed away.
The laughter that followed was low and bone-chilling, a sound that seemed to echo in the air long after it had stopped. Her grip tightened, pulling him toward the water. As he struggled to break free, his fingers scraped against the muddy ground, but it was as if the earth itself was pulling him in, working against him.
Why do you think you are still here?
She crooned, her voice full of cruelty and amusement.
You didn't escape me then, and you will never escape me now.
Marcus screamed in terror, the sound echoing through the empty night. He had no idea how much time passed, how long he fought to free himself from her grip. Every time he thought he had gained even an inch, she would pull him back. The lake, dark and foreboding, seemed to be alive, an abyss that was pulling him deeper and deeper into its cold embrace. His heart pounded so hard he thought it might burst from his chest, but no matter how hard he pulled or how loudly he screamed, the mermaid's grip never loosened. She was relentless, dragging him closer to the edge of the water until his feet no longer touched solid ground. And then, just like that, he was submerged. The water rushed over his head, drowning out the sounds of the night, drowning out everything. His vision swirled, his lungs screamed for air, but there was nothing but the crushing weight of the water and the cold embrace of the lake. He opened his mouth, desperate for breath, but water filled his lungs, and then the world went black. The blackness was all-encompassing. It was as though he had been swallowed by the lake itself, a vast, inescapable void that pulled him deeper and deeper, every inch of his body suffocating under its weight. His chest burned as his lungs screamed for air, but there was nothing. The cold seemed to seep into his bones, freezing him from the inside out, until even the terror that had once pulsed through his veins turned to numbness. It was a cold unlike anything he had ever felt, a soul-chilling cold that stole his very will to fight. Time seemed to stretch, elongating into eternity. Marcus's mind, once so sharp, began to dull, as though the darkness was suffocating the last remnants of his consciousness. His thoughts fractured like glass, slipping away into the abyss. The mermaid's face, twisted with that cruel, gleaming smile, danced before his eyes, an endless nightmare chasing him, keeping him tethered to this terrible, suffocating place. And then, nothing. The pressure in his chest lifted. The water no longer surrounded him. Marcus gasped, his body instinctively jerking upward, his lungs burning with the desperate need to inhale. He was no longer submerged, no longer drowning in the cold depths of the lake. But the world around him was not the same. The water was gone, replaced by an impenetrable darkness. He sat up, coughing violently as he dragged in great, ragged breaths, trying to clear the water from his lungs. But even as he did, something felt wrong. The air, heavy, thick, and suffocating, was different. It was stale, carrying the smell of rot and decay, an odor that clung to his skin, making him gag. He shuddered, his heart still pounding wildly in his chest. The lake was no longer behind him. He had no idea where he was.
The very ground beneath him felt wrong, soft, shifting and damp. His fingers brushed against the ground, and when they pulled back, they were smeared with something wet, something sticky. Marcus looked down, but the darkness was so complete, he could see nothing. The air was still, the silence almost unbearable, except for the faint, almost imperceptible sound of breathing. Slowly, carefully, Marcus rose to his feet. His limbs felt weak, as though they no longer belonged to him, but he forced himself to take a shaky step forward. His heart hammered in his chest. He could feel the weight of something watching him, something ancient and malevolent, pressing down on him from all sides. The air seemed to pulse with a presence that made his blood run cold. Then, from somewhere in the depths of the dark, a low, guttural growl rumbled, sending a shiver down his spine. It was a sound that wasn't quite animal, yet wasn't fully human either. The growl seemed to shake the very air, vibrating through his bones, and with it came the unmistakable sense of danger. Something was coming, something was close. Marcus's breath caught in his throat as he heard a sound, the unmistakable scrape of claws against stone. It was slow at first, deliberate, as though it were enjoying the terror it was causing. And then the sound grew louder, more insistent, accompanied by the deep, rumbling growls that seemed to come from every direction at once. His pulse quickened, his body frozen in terror, as the growl grew nearer. He couldn't see it, but he could feel it. The air felt heavier, thicker, as though something massive, was moving through it. The ground trembled beneath his feet, and a horrible screeching sound filled the air, followed by a sharp, horrifying growl, a sound that tore through the silence like a blade, chilling him to the bone. And then, suddenly, it appeared. It emerged from the darkness, stepping into a faint patch of moonlight, though its shadow seemed to stretch far beyond the light's reach. It was huge, impossibly so. Its body was massive, rippling with muscle, and covered in thick, matted black fur. Its head was like a twisted nightmare, elongated, with glowing red eyes that seemed to burn with an unnatural fire, fixed on Marcus as if it could feel his fear. Its mouth was a grotesque snarl, fangs like daggers bared, dripping with saliva as it breathed heavily. But worse than its appearance was the sheer intensity of its presence, the overwhelming sense that this thing was not meant for this world, that it came from some dark, forbidden place. Its claws scraped across the stone ground, each movement deliberate, as if savoring the fear it was feeding on. Its eyes glowed brighter, and the growl it emitted was no longer low, but guttural and deafening. The very earth seemed to quake beneath it, as if the creature itself was a manifestation of pure darkness, a primal force of nature that existed to destroy. Marcus stood frozen, every muscle in his body screaming for him to run, but his legs wouldn't move. His vision blurred as he realized with growing horror that he couldn't escape. The creature was too fast, too powerful, and even if he could flee, the darkness itself would swallow him whole. There was nowhere to go. The creature stalked toward him, its steps deliberate, its red eyes gleaming with hunger. It opened its mouth wide, revealing rows upon rows of jagged, sharp teeth. The air around it seemed to vibrate with malevolent energy, and Marcus could feel his very soul being pulled toward it.
like it was draining him of his very will to live. Then, the creature lunged. Marcus barely had time to react, his body moving on instinct as he fell backwards, scrambling to put distance between himself and the monster. His heart raced in his chest, and he could hear nothing but the deafening sound of his own panicked breath and the deep guttural growls of the creature as it lunged again. It was no use. The beast was too fast. It caught him with its clawed hand, and before he could scream, it pulled him into the darkness. The world was a blur of blackness and shifting shadows. Marcus's heart raced in his chest, his breath coming in sharp, shallow gasps, as the massive, glowing-eyed creature dragged him into the depths of the lake. He had no idea where he was, only that every part of him screamed that he was doomed, that he was being pulled into the abyss, the final resting place of those unlucky enough to be lured by the lake's dark secrets. The claws, like sharp daggers, dug deeper into his flesh, tearing at his skin, leaving deep, agonizing gouges that burned as though the very essence of the lake itself was poisoning him. His blood mixed with the murky water, swirling around him like a red vortex. He tried to scream, but no sound escaped his lips, as if the water itself had claimed his voice. The creature's growls reverberated in his skull, the sound of its unholy presence growing louder and louder with each passing second, until it consumed every ounce of his thoughts. He had never been so terrified, never felt so helpless. The water seemed to drag him deeper, heavier, suffocating him with its crushing weight. He felt as though the darkness itself was closing in on him, pulling at his soul, its icy grip digging into the very core of his being. His body fought against the pull, his legs kicking, his arms reaching out, but the strength of the creature and the weight of the water were too much. Then there was a shift. The growling stopped, replaced by a faint, otherworldly humming. The water, which had once been cold and suffocating, began to swirl around him in strange, rhythmic patterns, as if it had come alive. His lungs burned with the need for air, but his body refused to move, frozen in a grip of terror. In the distance, a flicker of light caught his attention. It was faint, almost imperceptible at first, but then it grew brighter, slowly piercing the suffocating dark. He turned his head, trying to focus through the blur of his panicked vision. At first, he thought it was just a hallucination, a flicker of his fading consciousness. But as the light grew closer, he realized it wasn't just a figment of his imagination. It was her, the mermaid. Her long, flowing hair gleamed silver under the water, and her eyes, glowing like twin orbs of molten fire, locked onto him. But there was something different about her now. Her face twisted, contorting into a dark, malevolent grin as she drew closer. Her once serene beauty was now tainted with an otherworldly hunger, a hunger that could only be sated by the death of those who dared to venture into her domain. Marcus's heart slammed against his chest as he watched her move, her delicate, translucent fins glowing like eerie lanterns in the water. But it wasn't the beauty of her movements that made his blood run cold. It was the way she approached him, as though savoring the fear coursing through his veins, knowing that he was helpless, that she had already claimed his soul. The moment she drew near, he felt a coldness sweep over him, colder than the lake had ever been. It was as though the very essence of death was radiating from her, reaching into his very soul. And then, without warning, she lunged,
Marcus screamed, a ragged, choking sound, as her hands wrapped around his throat. Her skin was ice cold, and yet it burned with an unnatural fire. She squeezed tighter, her grip tightening with every second, as her cold eyes burned into his soul. He could feel himself slipping, his life draining away with each breath he couldn't take, each second that passed. And yet, through the haze of pain and fear, something inside him sparked. Something deep within him screamed that he couldn't die here. Not like this. His limbs, numb and frozen, suddenly surged with adrenaline. His hand found something solid, something sharp. He wasn't sure what it was, but in that moment, survival took over. With one desperate, frantic movement, he slashed at the mermaid's arm, the sharp object tearing into her icy skin. She let out a screech, high-pitched and deafening, but it was enough. The grip on his throat loosened, just for a moment. That was all he needed. With all the strength he could muster, Marcus kicked free from her grasp, his lungs burning for air. He scrambled upward, his hands clawing at the surface, his mind a haze of fear and panic. His vision swam, his body too weak to fight the pool of the lake, but he fought anyway. He breached the surface. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, he gasped for air, sucking in huge, ragged breaths. The cold air filled his lungs, but it didn't feel like a victory. He was still trapped in this nightmarish place. The mermaid, her furious growl echoing through the water, was still out there. But Marcus had a glimpse of something else, the faintest hint of hope. He kicked his legs, pushing himself through the cold water, the world spinning around him. Every part of him ached, but he kept swimming. His arms moved, not thinking, just moving, desperate to escape. His eyes were fixed on the shoreline, the faint outline of the forest visible through the fog. There, he thought, if he could just get to the shore, to safety, to where the land could save him. Behind him, a distant, horrifying screech echoed through the night, but he dared not look back. The water felt deeper now, heavier, and the pool of the lake seemed stronger with every stroke, as though the water itself didn't want him to leave. But he kept fighting, pushing himself harder and harder, ignoring the fear that clutched at his chest like a vice. And then, after what felt like an eternity, his hands scraped against the muddy shore. He gasped in relief, but the battle wasn't over yet. With all the strength he could summon, he pulled himself from the lake, crawling onto the soft, wet earth, gasping for breath. His body shook with exhaustion and terror, but he had made it. For the first time since he had entered the water, he allowed himself a single breath of hope. But as he lay there, panting and trembling, he heard it again. A voice, distant and mocking, whispered across the shore, sending a shiver down his spine.
You can never escape me.
Marcus froze. He was free. But only for now. Thank you for listening to Whispers in the Dark. If you'd like to support the show, head over to our Patreon, where you can sign up to one of 3 different tiers. Or if you'd prefer to make a one-off contribution, maybe you'd like to buy me a coffee. Don't forget to follow us on Facebook and YouTube to stay up to date with new episodes, behind-the-scenes content, and more chilling tales. And remember, you've heard the whispers. But some doors, once opened, never truly close. If you feel something watching tonight, don't look back. We'll see you next time, if the dark lets you go.